Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this recorded version of the Endocrine System Lab. We're doing this because of the Wednesday and Thursday campus closure. And this recorded version gives everybody the most flexibility of spending time with this material without any interruptions at home during a long multi-hour Zoom meeting. So by the time you seeing this recording, you must have been exposed in lecture to at least some, maybe a lot, of the endocrine system as chapter 18 is looking at it. So what you see in the lab is a very simple version, especially the physiology part of this, how this endocrine system works. We are going to name pretty much all the glands and their hormones here in the lab and in lecture as well. The most useful aspect of the lab is that you will see these endocrine glands on models in their normal location instead of an artistic rendering. And we have microscope slides as well to go along with describing production of these hormones. So first, what you need to go along with this recording, you will need a lab report. I will be attaching a PDF file next to this recording, and you will need your lab manual. We'll be starting on page 410. There's this table 25.1. It goes all the way onto the next page 411 in my lab manual. So we'll be following that in conjunction with the lab report. So I'll be doing a lot of screen sharing, as you can imagine, showing models and microscope slides and some of my own artistic rendering. So I'm going to start with the screen sharing. I usually put this on a board, but here it is in a slide format. Let me see if I can find this. I think this is it. So here is the first part to this lab, a limited aspect of the physiology. Let me see if I can make this full screen here. Eventually, it may be, here it is. So the role of homeostasis for the endocrine system is very difficult to put in simple words because these endocrine glands making up the endocrine system create and regulate a large number of very different functions. So the role in homeostasis is summed up by this bottom line here. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into blood. So this is the key to endocrine glands. The unusual aspect of the endocrine system that these glands are not physically connected into a single organ system. Think about the stomach being part of the digestive system. The stomach has to be connected to the esophagus on one end and the small intestine to the other end. Otherwise, the stomach cannot fulfill its digestive function. Think about the urinary bladder in the urinary system. If you want to store urine, urine must be coming into the bladder through the ureter and will be emptied out through the urethra. So the bladder is an integral part of the other organs in the urinary system. This is not so with the endocrine system. Glands operate totally independently, and you'll see sometimes there's some functional connection between them, but by and large, they are independent contractor, if you want to put the endocrine glands this way. So this illustration shows you these wonderful blue hormone molecules made by endocrine glands. And because endocrine system changes, directs activity of the rest of the body, other organs. So here are two cells. And at this point, none of these cells can react to the hormone's message. None of them can follow the instruction of the hormone. because the cells need a component that makes them sensitive to the message of the hormone. In your lab report, you're reading the role of hormone receptors as essential participants. So let me see if I can go to the next slide here. You see the receptors. I just, for the sake of simplicity, put them on the surface of the cells. Receptors are mostly protein molecules that match the size and shape of the hormone and allowing this very tight interaction that you see here. And this interaction between hormone and its receptor will make the cell, the cells that carry the hormone, target cells. So when you're reading your lab report, the presence of hormone receptors on cells make those tissues and organs into, the answer is target cells. The cell you see here on the left is not a target cell. Hormones will float by this cell, cannot deliver the message. The target cells must have these receptors to understand the message of the hormone. When you look in the lab manual, you see 4 columns in this table: name of the gland, list of the hormones, location of target cells is the 3rd column. So what we'll be seeing as we look through this list of hormones is that some hormones have receptors on almost all cells in the body, but some hormones have receptors on a very small group of cells in the body. And so the hormone's message can be delivered to many cells or very few cells, all dependent on the receptor on the cells. So receptors will make the cells target cells for the instruction of that hormone. Another indication of the importance of receptors is that if you think about disorders of the endocrine system, it's kind of easy to see that if an endocrine gland is defective and not making hormones, that could lead to a pathology. One aspect of our homeostasis is not going to be adjusted. Think about type 1 diabetes. The hormone insulin is missing because the pancreas is not making it or not making it large enough amount. And so that leads to a disorder. Type 1 diabetes is a disorder of the missing hormone. It is a little more difficult to see that a missing receptor can also lead to disorder. Think about type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a disorder of receptors where the receptors are partially missing. Some of the receptors are totally bent out of shape, unable to interact with the hormone. In early and mid stages of type 2 diabetes, there's plenty of hormone, plenty of insulin, but the cells, the target cells, can no longer understand the message of the hormone because the cells don't have enough receptors or the receptors are misshapen. So endocrine disorders can come from having too little hormone or no hormone, missing hormone, missing receptors. In lecture part, we'll be talking about some disorders where hormones are overproduced and their presence lead to overstimulation. That's another set of disorders. So bottom line, excuse me, both hormones and the receptors are essential for the workings of the endocrine system. We will be mentioning receptors only here and there, but the 3rd column in this lab manual, location of target cells, tell you where the receptors are found in the body. So when you look at this list of hormones and a list of, I guess, just numbers right now in the lab report, we are starting with hormones within the anterior pituitary. So we do have 2 types of models. I'm going to have one pictured here. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to have to switch sharing here, so bear with me with a minute. And we are going to go to our favorite location, lab shell. So here is a half head model. And right here in this little cup-like protected area of the sphenoid bone, this cup-like structure is called the sella turcica. And you see this pink chunk of small plastic. This is small chunk of plastic. This is the pituitary gland. This is the size of a green pea. So by size, there's not much to it, but when we look at the list of hormones that are coming from it, pretty significant pretty significant endocrine gland. In lecture, we will talk about the role of hypothalamus in guiding the actions of the pituitary. The hypothalamus, I just labeled it to show that how close it is to the pituitary. We will not focus on the hypothalamus here in lab. In lecture, we will have quite a bit to say about the hypothalamus. So I just want to indicate the proximity to the pituitary gland. So from this pituitary gland, we have a large list of hormones divided by anterior and posterior pituitary. So let me switch back to the set of these lab slides. And here is going to be my artistic rendition of the pituitary gland. And so here's this green pea. Here's the much larger anterior and a smaller posterior lobe or portion. So you see the hormones listed here. Let's start with the anterior pituitary. What you see here are the accepted abbreviations or acronyms for these hormones. You're welcome to use this or the full name. The first hormone on our list is, and I'm trying to follow as much as possible the lab manual. There's a lot more room to take notes in the lab report. This is why you see that spacing there. So number one is growth hormone, or GH with the abbreviated format. Growth hormone has receptors on virtually all cells of the body. And when you look at the location of target cells in your lab manual, it lists a few specific tissues, but there's also the note other body tissues. So if you're making flashcards, want to keep this simple, all cells in the body can be the shortest way to express the location of target cells for growth hormone. For the hormone function, we're going to abbreviate this to, please just underline or highlight, stimulate body growth and metabolism. In lecture, we will talk about the middleman. There is an additional local hormone that enhances the activity of growth hormone. We are not going to get into that here in the lab. So, excuse me, growth hormone stimulates body growth and metabolism. In lecture, you have or you will be seeing a picture of Robert Wadlow, graduate of Alton High School, and he had a tremendous overproduction of growth hormone, instructing his cells to respond by cell division. And this is where his 8 feet 9 inches height came from, that overproduction of growth hormone. The second hormone, TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a hormone with very narrow target range, stimulates only the thyroid gland, and the function is to stimulate secretion of hormones from thyroid gland. So here's the first example when the pituitary is in charge of another endocrine gland. And we'll have a much more detailed segment about the thyroid gland itself. For the third and fourth hormones, you'll see a very unusual setup and very small number of target cells, testes or ovaries. So let's start by describing the functions of these two hormones in the ovaries. These hormones were named based on female reproductive biology, and it's a lot easier to understand the names. So hormone number 3 on our list here is FSH. This is called follicle stimulating hormone. When you read the function for the ovaries, you read stimulates oocyte production and estrogen secretion. Well, both of those functions are the result of the growth of follicles, these liquid-filled structures inside the ovary. So this is where the name follicle stimulating hormone comes from. Follicles grow inside the ovary as a consequence of this hormone. To the shock of the biology establishment, it turns out that males also have a very generous amount of FSH in their blood. So males very rarely have ovaries. So the biology community started to search for a function, and it turns out that follicle stimulating hormone in males act on the testes and stimulates sperm production. The details of all these reproductive functions will come to us in the reproductive system towards the end of the semester. Hormone number 4 is luteinizing hormone, or LH. Again, let's talk about the role in ovaries, triggers ovulation, and stimulates secretion of estrogen and progesterone. Ovulation in the ovary results in the formation of a yellow body. Luteum means yellow, and corpus luteum is the result of ovulation. So luteinizing hormone leads to the appearance of that yellow body, corpus luteum. So yet again, LH, luteinizing hormone, was named after its role in female reproductive biology. Again, to the shock of the biology establishment, there is a generous amount of LH in male individuals as well. Yet again, testes are the target in males, and stimulation of testosterone production is the role here. Please notice that FSH and LH yet again stimulates two endocrine glands, ovaries and testes. So even more control is given to the pituitary over other endocrine glands. Hormone number 5 is prolactin. Prolactin has a narrow target range, mammary glands. It stimulates milk production. This activity starts third trimester in pregnancy and continues on during the lactation period after the birth of the newborn. And the last, number 6, is ACTH. This is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the target cell is yet now a new endocrine gland, the adrenal gland, and only the cortex portion. We'll have details about the adrenal gland a little later. So in the adrenal cortex, the ACTH hormone stimulates hormone production. So pituitary, through the hormones made by the anterior pituitary, controls thyroid gland, ovaries, testes, and the adrenal cortex. This is the reason why endocrinologists call the pituitary gland the most essential endocrine gland in the body. When you look in your lab manual, there's a line number 7. Please scratch that. You don't see number 7 in the lab report. We're just going to ignore that, leave a short statement on that to lecture. So while anterior pituitary is an honest to goodness endocrine gland, the cells here are making all these hormones that you see listed. When we look at the posterior pituitary, there's no hormone production here. This is a curious case where hormones only released in the posterior pituitary, not made. Where do the hormones come from? Well, the hormones, ADH and oxytocin, are made in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus developed a pipeline that brings those hormones from way up here from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary for release. So this is why you see the statement, no hormones made here. When you look at the importance of these hormones, ADH and oxytocin, it is astonishing that these hormones are made by actually a part of the brain, hypothalamus. Again, they are only released at the posterior pituitary. Hormone number one in the posterior pituitary is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone, the name suggests that it cuts back on urine volume, urine production. So the target is the kidneys, and we're going to reword this function. So let's make the function sound like this. Antidiuretic hormone increases water absorption from urine. So when we are dehydrated or have other conditions that leads to blood loss or too low blood pressure, antidiuretic hormone will reclaim water from the forming urine stream inside the kidneys and absorb that water from urine into the bloodstream. This action saves our butt when we are mildly dehydrated, and this is the body's response to a low reading on our water gauge. We'll say a lot more about ADH in the urinary chapter. The kidneys are just a tremendously hardworking organs, not only removing waste products, but also help us adjust blood chemistry, including the water content of our blood. So antidiuretic hormone, narrow target range, stimulates absorption of water from urine. And the last hormone here from the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Oxytocin is another tremendously important hormone. Normal vaginal delivery and labor depends on the stimulation of oxytocin. Oxytocin acts for labor and delivery on the smooth muscles of the uterus. We'll talk about that, of course, yet again in the reproductive system. Without oxytocin, there is no normal labor and delivery. Think about the importance of vaginal delivery to the maintenance of mankind. In the last 100 years or so, we have a cesarean section option, but if you think back the history of mankind, we have relied on maintaining the human species on this hormone, oxytocin. Without that, there would be no newborns. So somewhat important. And so this is the end to the pituitary gland. If you have any questions during this recording, please send me a message through the class shell. And this is true, of course, for all the rest of this presentation. So after the pituitary gland, we'll switch to the thyroid gland. In the lab manual, you see 3 lines. In the lab report, only 2. Hormones number 1 and 2 in the lab manual, we'll group them into 1 line. And let's see. I'm going to switch sharing here back to the lab shell. And let's see, I need to find this right connection here. So, right. So here you see the thyroid gland on this large larynx model. Later on, there's an image about the mini torso as well. So here's our Adam's apple, thyroid cartilage, part of the larynx, and a little bit under and behind, here's thyroid gland, and here are the hormones. So the first line in the lab report, please put down T3 and T4. And on the second line, please put down calcitonin. Looking into the lab manual, T3 and T4 has receptors in most body cells. So T3 and T4 hormone, these hormones are sometimes called thyroxine. Most body cells will be affected by these hormones. The effect of T3 and T4 on cells is to speed up chemical reactions, in more specific words, speed up or increase metabolism. With increased metabolism, there's a side effect, which is increased heat production. We'll be seeing these hormones later on in chapter 25 in lecture as being part of maintaining core body temperature. Our body heat that needs to be produced constantly is coming from chemical reactions, metabolic reactions. So T3 and T4 can perk up those reactions and increase the speed of them and increase heat production as well. The increased heat is measured as basal metabolic rate, or BMR. That is also mentioned here in the lab manual. Calcitonin, when you look at the lab manual, has a very narrow group of cells, osteoclasts. So osteoclasts are bone degrading cells, and calcitonin will slow down osteoclasts. So this is not a stimulatory effect, but osteoclasts will be slowed down in their activity. So what happens when osteoclasts are slowed down in the activity in the bone, osteoblasts will gain the upper hand and bone building becomes faster. That means that calcium from the blood will be incorporated into this new bone. So the ultimate effect of calcitonin is a decrease in blood calcium levels. So blood calcium is tightly monitored. We have to have the optimal blood calcium levels for blood clotting. You'll see this in lecture very soon. We'll need optimal calcium level in the blood to maintain proper contraction of the cardiac muscle. You'll see this very soon in lecture as well. So this is how our body keeps blood calcium levels in the normal range, preventing an overshoot. So if we have calcium surplus in the blood, calcitonin sends out a signal to osteoclasts, slow down in your activity, and the surplus calcium will be stashed away in bones. In addition to these two strikingly different hormones, they are produced at strikingly different location within the thyroid. So the thyroid gland has a very peculiar microscopic structure. Let me see if I can find this among the list of microscope slide. I'm going to try to go here, and no, I think right here. So you see the microscope slide for thyroid gland. These large bubbles are follicles of the thyroid gland, and the follicular cells, the cells that surround the follicle. A follicle is filled with a liquid called colloid, and some of the chemical reactions that make T3 and T4 are there. Ultimately, it's the follicular cells that are responsible for making T3, T4. We'll see the entire process in lecture. So the location within the thyroid gland for T3 and T4 production is the follicles, and follicular cells are ultimately responsible for making T3 and T4 hormones. Outside of these follicles, sometimes you see these chunks of cells, these clumps of cells. There's no liquid-filled lumen here. These clumps are made up of parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells make calcitonin. So when it comes to monitoring blood calcium levels, it is the parafollicular cells that do that. And when there is a too high blood calcium level, parafollicular cells secrete the calcitonin. So there's a division of labor inside the thyroid gland. Follicular cells responsible for producing T3, T4, and parafollicular cells are responsible for producing calcitonin. So we will continue on this topic of blood calcium regulation. So if we have surplus calcium in the blood, we can normalize blood calcium levels by secreting calcitonin from the parafollicular cells. What if we have a calcium deficit in the blood? Our body reacts to that too. And that is the function of another hormone from another gland. So I'm gonna see if I can find this gland. Right. So the next hormone on our list and the next gland are the parathyroid gland. So here we are again in this large larynx model. Here's the thyroid in brown. But if you look closer on the backside of the thyroid gland, there is a totally differently behaving small cluster of cells. These small groups are kind of pinkish in color here on this model. These small group of cells make up the parathyroid glands. They secrete a hormone called PTH, or parathyroid hormone. So there's a single line here in the lab report. Parathyroid hormone also targets osteoclasts. So very small group of cells are targeted. And in this case, osteoclasts are speeded up in their action. So if calcitonin was the brake pedal for osteoclast, parathyroid hormone is the gas pedal for osteoclast. So when we have calcium deficit in our blood, we will be gaining calcium for the blood from the bones. A speedy osteoclast will excavate bone matrix, release the degraded calcium into the blood, and that's where the calcium is coming from to maintain, to restore normal blood calcium levels. So parathyroid glands, again, monitor blood calcium levels. They get activated when blood calcium levels are too low. And through stimulating the actions of osteoclasts from the bones, calcium is released to make up for that calcium deficit in the blood. We'll be seeing control of inorganic components of the blood. We have already seen ADH, antidiuretic hormone, maintaining water, proper water level in the blood, even if it comes to reclaiming water from urine. We have now seen maintenance of calcium levels in the blood, and we'll be seeing very, very soon maintenance of sodium levels in the blood. So blood chemistry is frequently controlled by action of hormones, as you have already seen. The next gland in this sequence is the adrenal gland. Oh, let me see if I can find an adrenal gland on this list. Here's one of our models from the lab. We'll be seeing very soon a minute or so image of this too. So the adrenal gland is right on top of the kidney. We have cortex and medulla, and the cortex is responsible for making 3 hormones, and the medulla 2. We will be going in a slightly different order here. So the first hormone is aldosterone, and this is a misspelling here. So instead of a D, there's a T here. This is hormone number 1 from the cortex. You might want to make a note here that all hormones made from the cortex are steroids. This is a big deal biochemically because steroids were known to be made only by gonads. And here is now a totally different part of the body, which has very little to do with reproductive functions, is making steroids. This shocked the world of biochemists when this was discovered and described. So again, a hallmark of adrenal cortex that it makes steroid hormones. And the first example of the steroid hormone is aldosterone. Again, it's a T and not a D here. Sorry about the typo. When you look at the lab manual, you see the targets in kidneys. We're going to reword the function of aldosterone. Aldosterone stimulates sodium absorption from urine. In other words, aldosterone stimulates absorption of sodium into blood. So if we have a sodium deficit in our blood, aldosterone can reclaim sodium from forming urine and make up that sodium deficit. Sodium is tremendously important. You have seen that in lecture chapter 16, 17. Sodium ions, the movement of sodium ions responsible for depolarization in our nervous system. So we must have enough in our blood. And in case of sodium deficit, aldosterone can absorb sodium from urine and move it into blood. Another example of maintaining blood chemistry. The second hormone from the cortex is cortisol. Now, cortisol has 2 very different actions. One is increasing blood glucose levels. The target for that is liver and skeletal muscle. So cortisol goes to these organs and tell them, give up your stored glycogen, chop glycogen up into glucose molecules and release into the blood. Especially during stress conditions, cortisol is responsible for increasing blood glucose concentration. The other totally different action of cortisol is the effect on white blood cells. Cortisol lowers the activity of white blood cells. This is important because white blood cells are the root cause of inflammation. And in medical practice, clinical practice, cortisol is frequently used in a form of injection. Cortisol is also used in topical lotions, creams to tame or decrease inflammation. A lot of times inflammation inside joints come with pain. Cortisol can be used to manage that by reducing inflammation. And cortisol in topical application can reduce irritation of the skin, which a lot of times leads to more itching than pain. So there are 2 very different target cells and target tissues for cortisol, and with the very separate function in those two groups of target cells. The third steroid here that we'll mention from the cortex is DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone. DHEA has many target cells, uterus, mammary glands, and other body cells involved in secondary sexual characteristics. This hormone DHEA is not effective or not significant in males because those secondary male sexual characteristics are stimulated by testosterone a lot stronger. But in females, this hormone DHEA can be a source of increased sex drive or libido and other appearances, masculine appearances of the body. So DHEA is more important for female reproductive biology than for male reproductive biology. The medulla portion of the adrenal gland secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. I'm hoping these words sound familiar because these are the neurotransmitters we have looked at in chapter 15 in AMP1. The sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system release norepinephrine on targets to create a fight or flight response. So before we go into detailing this fight or flight response, let me switch sharing, and we'll go to this set of PowerPoints and say goodbye to the pituitary gland. So here is another lab model. You can see the kidney, and to our great surprise, here is a cut open adrenal gland. So here you see the adrenal cortex. Again, the hormones are listed here, and the adrenal medulla with its epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones. So let's say a few words about these hormones. We're going to expand our location of target cells because it's just a very plain description, lab manual, body cells involved in fight or flight response. So the list of organs where epinephrine and norepinephrine have most visible activity is cardiac muscle by increasing the heart rate and cardiac output. Epinephrine, norepinephrine targets smooth muscle, especially blood vessels, leading to higher blood pressure. Epinephrine, norepinephrine specifically targets iris. We have a dilated pupil during fight or flight response. And epinephrine, norepinephrine also targets the bronchioles in our lung. Bronchioles will dilate to allow more air into our alveoli. So those are probably the most significant specific targets for epinephrine, norepinephrine. In terms of hormone function, we'll just go with this promotes fight or flight response. To give this term the best understanding, please use all these words here, fight or flight response. It makes biological sense only if you have these three words next to each other. So this was our view of the adrenal gland, separate look at the cortex and medulla. And I believe in this PowerPoint, here is the mini torso. Here you see on the same model, the thyroid gland, an alternative view to that larynx model that you've seen. and the adrenal gland. So as you're listening to this recording, you have seen many demonstrations from the lab shell, and we'll keep going back to that. But you also see these slides, what I'm showing right now. This image is not in the lab shell. So in addition to the lab report, I will attach this PowerPoint next to the recording. So you can look at this one, the lab shell, and combine the images that you'll need for that practical next week. For the adrenal gland, we also have a microscope slide. So for that, I'm going to go to the lab shell. And to find the lab shell, we'll click right here. And let's see if I can find the adrenal gland microscope slide. When you look at this, this is fairly faint. You may want to turn down the light in your background. Under the microscope, this thin tissue appears when we cut the adrenal gland in a transverse direction. And so in the middle of this adrenal gland, you see huge blood vessels. This is the strip of cells that make up the medulla. So epinephrine, norepinephrine production comes from here. It's bracketed right here. Between these blood vessels at the center strip and the outside of the adrenal gland, this little thicker region is the cortex, and that is where all those steroid hormones are produced. So again, this is the microscopic look and the division of labor. In addition to that model that shows you cortex and medulla, this is a little different, a transverse cut as opposed to a more of a sagittal cut that you see on that model. I also want to say a word about questions put to you on a practical, although you will be seeing those questions on the lab home assignment. So when you see a microscope slide like this, and an arrow pointing, let's say, to this portion of the slide, the first question could be, name the organ pictured on this slide. The second question could be, name the portion pointed out by the pointer. So if the pointer is sitting right here, the answer would be cortex. Next question could be, at the same station, name a hormone made by this region of this organ. And then questions could be, name the target cells, name the function for that hormone that you named. So there could be a sequence of questions, or starting out from the organ. And this could be true for an organ on a Minotaur or any other model. So the contents of this table plus your notes, because some places we simplified content of the table, the content of this table plus your notes will be really essential part to answer all questions about the endocrine glands, their hormones, and their target cells and functions for this practical. So in terms of the truly full-time endocrine glands, we are done. We do have 3 part-time endocrine glands, the pancreas, ovaries, and testes on our schedule. So let me go to the pancreas first and see if I can find this. Nope, not quite. Right here. So this is one aspect of the pancreas. This is also visible on the Minotaur. So the pancreas secretes 2 enzymes, 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. The pancreas, most of the pancreas is busy with making digestive enzymes. We'll detail that in the digestive system, but small portions of the pancreas, pancreatic islets secrete insulin and glucagon. So I'm gonna see if I can find the microscope slide that goes with this organ. Pancreas is usually pictured behind and a little bit underneath the stomach. You can see the cut open middle of the pancreas on this illustration. When it comes to microscope slide, here you see a overwhelming amount of these darker pink cells. Those cells are working to make digestive enzymes, but the smaller clumps, the pancreatic islets, you see a few labeled here, but there are others. These are more gray in appearance. They are in the business of making insulin and glucagon. So when you look in your lab report, or you're writing this in your lab report, or look in the lab manual, the first hormone in the lab manual is insulin. Insulin has receptors on almost all body cells. And the function of insulin is to decrease blood glucose levels. Insulin achieves that by telling cells to soak up glucose from the blood. So an hour or two after consuming a meal, when our blood glucose levels skyrocket normally, insulin production from the pancreas helps to lower that blood glucose level back to normal. The second hormone, glucagon, has a very narrow target organ or target range, cells of the liver. Imagine that we are asleep 2 in the morning and our blood glucose keeps plummeting because our cells are still using glucose, but there's no new food item to be processed. We have absorbed everything from the dinner. So what is going to maintain normal blood glucose levels? And this is where the pancreas starts making the hormone glucagon. The glucagon hormone will knock on the door of the liver and tells the cells to release glucose into the bloodstream while we are asleep. In chapter 25, we'll be looking at the dramatic events in the liver that kind of saves our lives during nighttime or every time we have too low blood glucose. So the effect of glucagon by acting through the liver is to increase blood glucose levels, raise blood glucose levels back to normal when we have glucose deficit in our blood. The last two endocrine glands here, part-time endocrine glands, are ovaries and testes. We will come back to these in much greater detail in the reproductive system. So let me see if I can find a model for this. All right, so let's start with the ovary. Here's our pelvic model, and this yellow chunk of plastic is the ovary. You see 2 lines in the lab manual. The first one, let's call it estrogen. The second one is progesterone. We can simplify the target cells that all body cells react to these hormones. All body cells are targets. You see here a little list, but when we talk about the effects of estrogen and progesterone in the body, in the reproductive system, you'll see that there are a huge number of cells in the body outside of the ones that are listed here that responds to estrogen and progesterone. The more narrow functioning of these 2 hormones stimulates secondary female sexual characteristics, regulates the female reproductive cycle. And the last endocrine gland on our list is yet another pelvic model. I believe this is showing the testis. So the testis secretes testosterone. And we've seen both the ovary and the testes under the control of FSH and LH. So the testes secrete testosterone. Testosterone also, we can declare, has all body cells as targets. And for the very simplified function of testosterone, stimulates development of male secondary sexual characteristics. From lab manual, we're going to scratch pineal gland and thymus. In the lab report, you see no more lines for hormones. So this is the end for this lab. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Again, next to this recording, you will see a lab report attached. Please print that and make notes on it. Practical is coming up next week. Not a bad idea to be prepared. And I will also attach the set of PowerPoint slides that accompany the images in the lab shell. So let me stop sharing here. All right. So thank you for looking at this recording. Again, practical is coming up next week. Please prepare the best you can. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. This recording goes out to students who will have practical on Wednesday or Thursday. So next Monday and Tuesday, you're welcome to come to the lab anytime. And I should say, come to the prep area of the lab because the lab will be set up for a practical, but you're welcome to look at these models. They will be set out for you to look at. So I'm going to say goodbye. This is the end of the Endocrine Lab recording. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me a message through the class chat.